Senator from Iowa.
I come to the floor to discuss with my colleagues the fact that agencies of the federal government aren't very insightful to make sure that taxpayers' money are spent properly, and also to say how they're not cooperating with the constitutional responsibility of Congress to make sure the money is spent in a legal way. In this case, I'm here to talk about the Environmental Protection Agency. On April 13th, I began an investigation into an EPA program called the Environmental Justice Collaborative Problem-Solving Cooperative Agreement Program. Now, that's quite a name, isn't it? On February 22nd this year, I issued a preliminary report on my investigation. The EPA program dishes out millions of taxpayers' dollars to left-leaning nonprofits. The funding is from the President Biden American Rescue Plan, which was opposed by Senate Republicans. According to the EPA, the purpose of this environmental justice program is to address environmental and public health issues in underserved communities. As part of that program, the EPA sent 34 individual nonprofits a combined $4 3/10 million, with each receiving up to $200,000. I think the money was meant to be spent for purpose of improving the environment, and I don't have any trouble with that, but I think you'll see that the grantees didn't use the money for what it was intended for. Now, I wrote to all 34 grantees because I wanted to know how they spent that taxpayers' money. I wrote to the EPA because I wanted to know how it was conducting oversight of that spending. You see, it isn't only Congress has a responsibility to see the money spent responsibly and according to Congress's will, but it's also up to these agencies to make sure that they spend the money accordingly. It's a pretty simple request. I want EPA to show your work, how the taxpayers' money is being spent. Well, this EPA, apparently to them, that question's just too much for them to handle. So guess what happened after I sent the oversight letters? The EPA interfered and told these 34 grantees that they, meaning the EPA, would handle the Grassley request. This led many grantees to refuse compliance with any congressional oversight request and also obstruct my efforts of getting answers for the taxpayers. Some grantees were so emboldened by EPA's obstructive conduct that they sent my staff emails, and this is just one example of the emails. Quote, "We report to EPA, and they're responding on our behalf. You can make your request to them. We won't be responding further. Don't contact us any further," end of quote. That's how they treat this senator doing his constitutional responsibilities. And obviously you can tell from that quote that that is very much obstruction. What the Biden EPA has done to obstruct a core constitutional requirement of the Congress That is, knowing how appropriated taxpayer money is being used by the executive branch. Moreover, the EPA couldn't even respond on behalf of grantees, and it's pretty simple because the EPA doesn't even possess the records that I was requesting from the nonprofits. That's a whole different problem for the EPA. Specifically, I asked grantees, and this is a quote from my letter, provide all records showing how the taxpayers' money your organization received was spent. In your production, please provide a financial summary showing what the taxpayers' money was spent for, end of quote from my letter. Amazingly, the EPA can't fulfill this request for grantees because at this point in the life cycle of the grant, it doesn't possess the records that show how taxpayers' money has been spent. Accordingly, except for my asking these questions, the EPA wouldn't have possessed these records at this point in the grant program. The EPA only has financial records showing how much money the grantees had drawn down from the overall grant. The EPA emailed my staff this, and I quote, "At the current stage in the grant process, this is the only document detailing financial progress that grantees are required to submit to the agency," end of quote. For context, the quote, "only document," end quote, referred to by the EPA doesn't show how and what taxpayers' money was being spent by each grantee. Now that's beyond embarrassing. It's a disgrace and a slap in the face to the taxpayers who work so hard for their money that the EPA has failed to track their money. The EPA is throwing taxpayers' money around without a care in the world. My preliminary oversight report also found that some of the projects didn't even pass the smell test. For example, grantees that did respond to us reported projects like empathetic listening training, tree walk and talks, making musical presentations to their communities, and buying clothing. And it turns out the lion's share of the money so far is being used for more salaries of the people that are on the nonprofit payroll and also other employee benefits. Many of the 34 grantees were unable to provide records showing how much money their projects could cost. Some were able to provide those records I asked for. Then why didn't all of the grantees? Well, I think going back to what I previously said, the EPA said you didn't have to answer. I think the taxpayers have a right to know these financial details. With Americans suffering from record inflation and being forced to make difficult financial decisions, the EPA's obstructive conduct towards the Congress and the EPA's weak and incompetent oversight all are insults to the American taxpayer. To make it worse, the EPA program I've talked about is just getting started. The EPA plans to spend tens of millions of dollars more in coming years on similar programs, and was spent, according to what I've been able to assess at this point, that means for more salaries and benefits probably for the employees of the organizations as opposed to helping us solve our environmental problems. I imagine one would be hard-pressed to find any American taxpayer that would be satisfied with the EPA's conduct in how this money is being spent. It's time for the EPA to do real oversight of how this money is spent. The American taxpayers deserve better from its government. So, as usual, the Grassley oversight will continue. I yield the floor. Suggests the absence of a quorum.